Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Amalia, and I'm a webinar manager at Terminal. Terminal is the world's first tech-enabled platform for remote engineering teams. Today, we're presenting Making Remote Official, the elements of a successful remote work policy. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Today's webinar is scheduled to last about 1 hour. All participants will be muted to enable the speakers to present without interruption. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your Zoom control panel. We'll have time to answer questions at the end of the webinar, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. We hope to make this an interactive experience, so during the webinar, we'll be asking poll questions. We'll announce polls as we launch them. A pop-up should appear on your screen, and you'll be able to submit your answer at that time. After today's webinar ends, we've also prepared a short feedback survey that will show up in your browser window. We appreciate you taking the time to answer these questions, as we'll use them to improve content going forward. Lastly, this webinar is being recorded, and a link to that recording will be sent via email within 24 hours. Now, before we start, I'd like to give participants a moment to take advantage of an early registration opportunity for a very exciting upcoming Terminal event. With this year's tectonic shifts in worker habits, and the tech talent shortage causing major hiring roadblocks, the time is now for businesses to build their approach to global recruiting and remote work. Plan your strategy at Unlock Summit, a free 2-day virtual event from September 15th to 16th, designed to help engineering and HR leaders overcome the most common barriers to rapid growth. You'll attend 2 days of impact-oriented presentations and breakout sessions, including keynotes from leaders like Don Sharifan, head of people at Slack, Andrew Dudum, founder and CEO at Hims & Hers Healthcare, and Peter Jackson, CEO at Bluescape, where you'll learn best practices for reaching beyond borders and growing your team quickly, efficiently, and without compromises. If this sounds interesting to you, check out our early speaker lineup and agenda through the link posted in chat, and register to join us in September. Moving on to our agenda. Today's webinar will start with a quick introduction to Terminal and Distribute. Next, we'll talk about why companies are increasingly offering remote work options after a workforce paradigm shift. We'll then dive into what organizations can do to effectively support remote work in the long term, and the key elements of a comprehensive remote work policy plan. Lastly, we'll have time at the end for Q&A. Now, without further ado, we'll turn the time over to our speakers. A little bit about our presenters today. Megan is helping to build the future of location-flexible work across the globe. She's a passionate advocate for the power remote work has to solve some of the world's biggest problems, positively impacting income and gender equality, environmental sustainability, and overall human health and well-being. She brings the unique expertise of building and leading co-located, hybrid, and fully remote teams, with a focus on optimizing for human experience and connection through culture development, leadership training, and policy construction. Tejal, as a veteran tech marketing executive, brings deep domain expertise across all facets of marketing, including brand, growth, and product. Previously, she led marketing at startups such as HackerRank and Collective Health, as well as leadership roles at Facebook, Google, and Salesforce. She's passionate about building marketplaces and leading global expansions. So welcome, Tejal. I'm going to let you take it from here to dive into our presentation.
Thanks, Amalia. Hi, everyone. Excited to be here to speak to you about how to make remote official. I'm Tejal Parekh, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Terminal. Before we talk about the webinar topic itself, though, I wanted to give you guys a quick overview on Terminal. We work with fast-growing tech companies to help them build, scale, and manage remote engineering teams. The company was launched 3 years ago and has been funded by some of the most high-profile VCs. And we have hired to date over 500 engineers. Our technology, our platform, and our services provide a simple, scalable way to hire engineers globally. And we do this through 4 key areas. We use our proprietary market intelligence and insights to help our clients determine which global market they should be hiring in. Our tech-enabled talent acquisition then makes the hiring process seamless and a lot faster. And once the engineers are hired, we fully manage their ongoing employee operations. And lastly, our bespoke programming helps engage, upskill, and retain these engineers that we've spent a lot of time and effort hiring. We hire engineers primarily in Canada and LATAM. And so by the virtue of what we do on a day-to-day basis, we do have firsthand experience with helping companies build and run remote teams successfully. And today, we've also invited Megan Dilley from Distribute, our partner in remote workspace. Just a little bit on Distribute and what they do. Distribute is a thought leader and a consulting firm that specializes in remote work and virtual organizational development. Their team of international telework experts help businesses start, strengthen, and use virtual workforces to solve corporate and socioeconomic concerns. Together today, we're really excited to share our learnings on policies, practices, and habits that help companies succeed in this new remote world. So with that, I wanted to just reflect on, what an unforgettable year 2020 was. It was a year that brought about many changes, but in particular, at least for all of us here today, the most significant change it brought about was a tremendous workforce revolution, turning remote work into our everyday reality. Earlier this year, we surveyed over 1,000 engineers to understand how their work had changed. And an overwhelming 74% of these respondents said that their companies adapted well to remote work in 2020. So that's great news, right? We saw a massive shift, and we saw that the employees felt that the companies responded well to the shift. Through our survey, we also learned that 8 out of 10 engineers reported they enjoyed the flexibility of remote work and wanted to retain at least some component of remote work when offices open again. Even more importantly, and this is very relevant to all of us here, employees whose companies don't offer remote options are today actively seeking out remote jobs. In fact, 40 to 55% of them said that they would quit if they did not have remote work options or remote work flexibility, which is a pretty staggering stat. And so in this hyper-competitive market to attract talent, companies need to adapt and offer remote options that are friendly to talent. That's the way to move forward in this new era and win in this market. And so we're already seeing this trend where leading tech companies are walking back their return to office plans. In fact, if you were to go on Hired, you'll see that 50% of their jobs on the platform include remote work. Again, a very compelling stat. And in the bigger scheme of things, remote work is good for the companies. It allows for hiring teams globally without the geographical constraint. For the companies, it offers them an opportunity to increase team diversity. As we all know, women and minorities are more likely to prefer the flexibility of remote work. And lastly, as the global internet consumption increases, increasing global representation on your tech teams is actually really good for business, because it's going to give you increased exposure through those global teams and through increased diversity on the team. So all in all, the key takeaway is that employees need to create a remote policy that meets both their own needs as well as their employee needs. So with that, I will take this moment to surface our first poll question. What are your top concerns about remote work? Take a few seconds to give us your input. All right, do we have the responses? Great. Well, we have a clear winner here, which is communication and alignment between employees. You know, this is also quite spot on, because we will dive into this through in some of the subsequent sections, as well as that continues to be the number one critical factor in making remote success. So good to see the alignment there. That's definitely something that's top of mind for everyone. With that, I would like to invite Megan from Distribute to dive into the specifics of how to set remote policy. Megan, take it away.
Thank you, Tejal. Thank you so much, Terminal team. Very happy to be here. And hello, everyone in the audience. I'm Megan. I'm a consultant at Distribute. I'm very happy to be here today to talk about remote policies. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about why remote policies matter. First and foremost, a remote policy, a lot of people don't realize, is actually it should be a legally binding document. So although regulation and legislation isn't super apparent for remote work today, there's going to be a lot of changes happening in the coming months and years. And it does behoove organizations to have a remote work policy in place to ensure that you are protecting both yourselves as an organization and your employees. So if you don't have a remote work policy in place yet, it's not too late. You should get started on that. It will be really vital in protecting everyone at your organization. And really at a baseline level, you should be thinking about your remote work policy as the overall structure of articulating what your remote offering is at your company. And this is something that is really key for talent acquisition and retention. This will be the document that a new employee sees and signs off on and reads through to decide whether or not your remote work offering is up to snuff and whether or not it's attractive enough to join your team. It's the same policy that your existing team members will review as you roll out either your new hybrid return to work plan or your fully remote return to work plan, and decide whether or not it's good enough for them, or if they'll go look for a role elsewhere elsewhere. So those are just some of the high level things that really make policy important. I know that policy, just even hearing that word kind of turns people off a lot of times. And this is definitely one of those things you shouldn't be turned off by. We'll break it down and kind of show you how it can be really manageable to implement one of these. And it's probably one of the most important things you can do, not only from a legal standpoint, but also just to be able to communicate expectations and align your team. Kind of going back to one of the main concerns on the poll there is ensuring that alignment and communication. Your remote policy is going to be one of your best tools to do that. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about successful policies. So an effective remote work policy certainly requires a lot of intention. Remote work in general, as a lot of you have seen, whether you were working remotely prior to the pandemic or you began working remotely as an emergency contingency plan with the pandemic, as you move into a sustainable model, whether that's hybrid or fully remote or something in between, you really are probably already starting to see that things need to be communicated and articulated, and you can't just send your employees home with a computer and hope that that will be something that will be sustainable for productivity, employee engagement, and connection over time. It reaches a certain point of saturation when you're just working at home with a computer. It's not enough. So an effective policy really reflects all elements of your entire virtual operation. It provides structure to your workforce and your leadership for how to operate within that virtual operation that you've built. It articulates the expectations that are needed to align your team and really enable productivity long-term. And it really prepares your managers to support and enforce those workplace rules that you're putting into place. And it helps your people get the most out of the flexibility of remote. And so when we look at the pillars of a successful remote work policy, sort of the main elements that go into this, you want to first and foremost set really clear objectives in your policy. So why are you offering remote in the first place at your organization? Is it because you are focused on cutting costs and maybe you have a goal to decrease your environmental footprint and you want to really start to cut down on real estate? That will take your remote policy in potentially a slightly different direction with different emphasis other than if you have an objective of, let's say, really focusing in on retention and attracting the best talent and really providing a flexible work model. And some examples of how those can differ is if you're really focused on talent attraction and retention, you might want to build a policy that is very flexible in terms of the geographic location you allow people to live and work from. So not keeping those constraints on maybe living and working within one state or one country, but really opening that up so people have flexibility to operate within that. You may also under that objective want to have more opportunities for well-being support. You may want to have higher stipends for home office setups and that kind of thing that really makes your remote offering super attractive to potential employees and existing employees. If you're more on the side of, the cost cutting and environmental impact benefits, you might decide that you will have less opportunities for people to travel maybe to a hub, to an office. You're not going to require people to commute in for your hybrid model to a meeting. You might go more on the side of fully remote versus hybrid, those sorts of things. So that's the first pillar, set those objectives. And once you set an objective, that means you'll be able to really clearly build the remainder of your policy. Without those objectives, the policy will feel a little bit disjointed. And we talked about the remote work policy being a legally binding document. This is in best case scenario, right? This is a one-time document that is signed by all involved. And this really helps protect your organization and the individuals. And so it's really important that this is something that's reviewed by your legal counsel and that everyone is feeling really comfortable with it. And it needs to be very specific. The remote work policy isn't intended to be something that kind of, dances across the trees. It is supposed to be concise and, easy to digest and not overwhelm your team with too much information, but it does really need to be quite specific so that people understand what constraints they can operate within and what the expectations are of them when they are working in a remote environment. It really needs to have a lot of detail so that they know exactly what support you're providing and they know exactly what is expected of them. So Tejal, now that we all have a better understanding of what remote policy might entail, where would you say that leaders should start?
Well, thank you for walking us through the pillars there. Companies and leaders need to first start by determining a remote structure that best works for them, that's suitable for them, for their organization, for the nature of the business that they are in, and the vast majority of the employee base that they have, right? So diving a little bit into this, companies and leaders need to really evaluate the spectrum of remote work models and see what is best suited for them, right? There is a spectrum of work models, remote work models, from fully distributed teams to static teams to static hybrid to dynamic hybrid. And as companies determine the right model for them, they do need to be mindful of not creating a class system. A hybrid approach to remote work in which some employees are in office more than the others has a very high potential to create a class system. Managers who aren't skilled at managing these remote employees could find themselves just naturally favoring the employees that they see in person more, frequently. So if your company is choosing to try a hybrid approach, you need to ensure that all employees are treated equally, that there's, attention to detail where even things like if there's going to be a meeting where you have some employees joining remotely, some in person, try and see if everybody else can join in through Zoom or VC functionality, because that provides greater meeting parity, right? So that's just one example, but there needs to be a lot more thought put into ensuring that all employees are treated equally, whether they are in office or if they are joining remotely. So with that, again, time for a quick poll. Want to ask you guys a question there. What remote configuration most closely resembles your plans? Again, take a few seconds and let us know what you think. All right. We again have a very clear winner here. Plan to offer remote work options to each employee. So that's really fantastic that a good majority of you are planning on offering some remote work options to your employees. And in fact, what's even more interesting is that 0% of you said that you're planning on bringing all your employees back in the office. That is, again, a strong indication here that all of you as people leaders, as leaders of your company, are listening to talent and really seeing what's happening in the market broadly, and leveraging those insights to make the right call here with respect to your employee base. And so with that, I would like to, invite Megan again to speak about, how would you advise clients on managing work hours and any kind of, physical space? Those seem to be two essential considerations here. So Megan, over to you.
Absolutely. These are certainly hot topics, within the world of remote and flexible work in general. How do we now transition from the office as our primary constraint to being so much more flexible and potentially having people working across different time zones now that people are allowed to move, or maybe they were working across different time zones before. But guidance around working hours is certainly something that you need to be super intentional about. And it's important to really, keep it simple. What does flexible hours mean for people at your organization? How do you think about working hours? It's completely fine to be an organization who says, we are dipping our toes into the world of remote work sustainably for the first time, quote unquote, post-pandemic, as things are sort of settling into our new normal. And, we're not quite ready as an organization to maybe allow for full flexibility of hours. And we are going to, for the next 3 to 6 months, start with, more standard business hours. It's completely okay to choose whatever model you want in terms of working hours. It's just important that you tell your people what those working hours expectations are. If you do go on the side of more flexible hours, make sure you let people know when they can reach each other and what those expectations are for response time. If it doesn't really matter if you have people working online at the same time because you don't need a lot of asynchronous, or you don't need a lot of synchronous communication, then fantastic. By allowing people to enjoy that flexibility, you will probably see higher rates of retention. You will see your people have higher engagement, and they'll experience overall increased well-being, which is fantastic. But if you allow flexible working hours and you don't articulate to people what response time needs to be, when they might need to be online within the day to kind of have overlapping hours, so they might be able to be reached in a more synchronous fashion via some of your messaging tools, that can cause a lot of problems, because you could have people who are trying to get a hold of one another and just aren't able to, or start to resent the fact that maybe a team member is working very flexibly and they feel like they're unable to. So really the big takeaway here is just ensure that you make a decision about what it needs to look like and communicate it. Flexible work doesn't mean that there's no structure, right? And I think that's one of the big misconceptions is with remote work and flexible work, is that it's kind of loose, and that is not recommended best practice to have a loose remote work structure. The structure that you articulate could be simply that we have flexible working hours, and we require that people are, generally online between the hours of 9 and 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time for any synchronous needs. But outside of those hours, you have your goals and objectives set, and we are a results-oriented work environment, so we trust you. We hired adults, you're an adult, you do your work, and we are here to support you. So really clarify what that looks like, clarify what that productivity looks like, and create reporting structures so people can actually check in on those things and feel like they are, there's visibility into the work that's being done and when it's being done. And most importantly, after you really set that structure in place for what working hours looks like at your company, make sure that you're training your managers so that they are really able to enforce that and help encourage that high trust working environment. And another hot topic of consideration is how we should utilize the office in this new world. So if you are implementing a hybrid model and you will have some sort of office space available, it's really important to communicate to your team what the intention of the office is. You don't want to leave the office as just sort of an open environment with a open door policy where people can come and go and work from there as they please. Of course, that's a decision you can make, but it's not recommended best practice to just allow the office to be open. You want to give people some structure for how they should be utilizing it properly, so you don't end up in a situation where you might have some workers that happen to live really close to your office and decide to utilize that office for work every day because maybe their home working environment doesn't feel as productive as it could be, or they just prefer going to the office. What can happen in that case, at face value, it sounds fine. Like, oh, we have an office. If people want to use it, let's let them use it. But if you dig a few levels deeper, what can start to happen is who are the people, you'll notice who are the people who are coming to the office versus who are those who aren't coming to the office. You know, oftentimes, and the pandemic really showed us this, that women and marginalized groups were the ones who, you know, had a really tough time with work because there was so much being asked of them. They're caregivers and doing other things. And in a, you know, non-pandemic times, you also have folks who are caregiving and doing those things as well, hopefully with more support, but they might be less likely to commute to the office or might live further from the office. And you don't want leadership or management to say, oh, so-and-so never comes to the office, and have that, you know, work against their ability to get that promotion or get that pay raise. We want to take visibility and office space out of the equation altogether as a means for, you know, really evaluating performance. So some ways you can be thinking about how we use these shared spaces is really say, okay, the office is an optional co-working space, but what is co-working at our company? And have some guidelines for, okay, co-working isn't happening 5 days a week if we're in a hybrid model. You know, suggested co-working could be something like this, but to not exceed X number of days. That kind of thing is helpful. It might be a great location to have on-site client meetings. And that's another good expectation to be able to communicate to people that that's what it should be used for. Team gathering hub, if this is something where, you know, individual teams might have a weekly or monthly meeting, and your workers are working within commuting distance to the office, you may decide that you require people to come to the office for that team meeting, or maybe all hands if you do have everyone working within commuting distance. It can be used as a gathering hub for those key events and meetings. It can be utilized as an onboarding location as well. And again, this is really dependent on whether or not your team will be located in that area. You can absolutely make the decision if you're hiring somebody in another state or country to, you know, travel permitting, to fly them to one of these hubs to do their onboarding, but just be careful about that as well, and know that, you know, if their experience is going to be mostly virtual, you know, starting them off with an in-person experience, it could present some challenges if their experience will be mostly virtual. So just keep that in mind. And if you're using it as a place to house company materials and resources, just make sure that these are specific. These are the specific resources that cannot be accessed virtually. Maybe it's around equipment or machinery, things that aren't able to be in a home office. If you're finding that your office space is being utilized as a resource for files that could otherwise be digitized, you're going to find that to be a problem for people who are working remotely because you're not ensuring equal access to information. Awesome. So as you think through these guidelines for remote structure, your ability to effectively communicate changes to employees can absolutely make or break efforts to operationalize. So Tejal, how do you set the right expectations?
Absolutely. Before I go into that, though, just a reminder for everyone, please, if you have questions, please, ask your questions. At the bottom of the window, you'll see a tab, you'll see a button for Q&A. We are already starting to see some questions come in. So feel free to put them in there and we will respond right after we are done with the subsequent set of slides. Cool. So, you know, to operationalize remote work, it starts at a very fundamental, like foundational level by setting clear expectations for your employees, right? We've talked about communication. There was a poll as well that talked about how communication remains an ongoing challenge. So, you know, let's just dive in there, you know, how to set clear expectations and communicate that, right? So as with any change management exercise, as leaders, you need to bring people bring your people along the journey, seek their input through surveys, get their ideas, get a sense for what are their top concerns, and do they have any suggestions on how to move forward with the remote work options. Work with your leads and your managers who may not necessarily be fans of remote work. I'm sure we've all had some of them, and they may have very valid concerns, and work with them on creative solutions, provide them appropriate training. And in case of resistance, whether it's from managers, whether it's from employees, be open to feedback and try to land on a collaborative solution that you can both work through and land on. One of the keys to also implementing a remote policy successfully is to clearly, very, very clearly articulate who is eligible. And so here, one needs to find creative ways to offer remote flexibility and be open to what roles can you offer remote flexibility to. And even if these roles aren't typically remote, try to find creative solutions for roles that are not remote compliant, where despite your best efforts to find creative solutions, you cannot see how certain roles could be remote compliant. Set expectations from the get-go. Letting people know ahead of time that certain roles are not eligible for remote will save both you and your employees a lot of headaches, and will, setting that clear expectation, being transparent about these expectations will also help you retain these right employees in the long run. All in all, your company's ability to effectively communicate the remote policy to your people is going to be critical to make this remote work for everyone in the long term. But equally important is your employees' ability to improve their own communication skills for a remote environment. Megan, what does it take to make sure that employees are equipped to manage remote communications?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it feels like one of those things that is often just sort of said and nobody really knows what it means. You kind of expect people to have good communication. Maybe it's written and verbal, but what does that really mean? And how do you actually set your team up to do that? So Amalia, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So it's really a must-have skill for remote work. In a remote setting, you have to communicate well and over-communicate. So you may think you're the best communicator in the world, and you very well could be, but you can't stop there. You have to communicate. And it feels like it gets old and you'll be a broken record, but I promise you it is the thing that will help you and your team be successful long-term. So some ways that you can really look at communication as a must-have skill for remote work is you have to start early on in the employee life cycle. Ask yourself, are you properly screening for communication skills in the hiring process? Hopefully the answer is yes. If not, that's definitely an area you should think about brushing up on. And then how are you training your employees to be effective communicators remotely? If strong communication skills are a strength of your organization, that's fantastic. It's a great baseline to build from, but know that you can't stop there. Next, you really have to strategize about how your team will utilize communication channels and articulate those specific expectations. So let's talk about how to build a structure that supports effective communication in a remote environment. So communication charter, this may be something that your organization has in place already. If you do, fantastic. I would recommend that you take another look at your communication charter and make sure that it is, it's being adapted for a remote work environment. If you don't have a communication charter in place yet, this is another great thing to start building. So your communication charter should really provide for a few different things. So first and foremost, you want to look at your digital infrastructure, the tools you have in place. What is your virtual office? Are people convening in Slack or Teams or elsewhere? And how are we supporting communication and collaboration on a daily basis through tools? Next is governance. What are the norms and expectations for usage by channel? Do we use email as an organization for internal messages, or do we simply use our messaging platform for internal messages? And email is really for external communication, those sorts of things. What about the response rates, the responsiveness for each particular channel? Perhaps in your messaging channel, you're looking for a quicker response rate or response time, sorry, thinking of all this marketing stuff, response rate. But how long is that you're required to respond to somebody? Is it 3 hours? Is it 24 hours? When should somebody start getting concerned that, oh, I haven't heard from them and I have an important question? Make sure to clearly articulate that. Give your team the training on the tools that you're using and the norms for using them to make sure that they're aligned within that communication structure. And make sure that people can access this information, and make sure that you're integrating your communication charter into your remote work policy and your company handbook. And then you have to enforce the structures and policies you put into place. And enforcement doesn't have to be a scary thing, but make sure that you're able to hold your team accountable to those expectations and be prepared to remind them on proper usage of those channels. So now that we've covered communication, let's go on to the last piece of our guide, benefits and compensation.
Fantastic. Let's talk through the remote specific benefits and comp, right? Obviously, this is the last bit. The key is to ensure that you've gotten the right structure in place, right communication channels open, and then the last bit is to think about thoughtfully about benefits and compensation that are geared towards your remote workforce. So here at the outset, I would just say that to attract talent, start offering generous remote benefits. For example, when we talk about equipment and travel, let's be clear about what you're willing to offer your remote employees as far as equipment is concerned. Will you be providing a stipend for home office equipment, high-speed internet, or a cell phone? These are very quickly becoming standard perks for employees. And so important to keep that in mind and align your benefits to what is quickly becoming an industry standard. Are the employees expected to pay for their travel to visit headquarters? Will you be compensating? What kind of allowance do they get for that? Also, show your employees that you care about their work happiness and ability to focus, and that you're really willing to put your money where your mouth is. As far as health benefits is concerned, this is obviously a very large area that has become increasingly important over the last 18 months. Consider tailoring your health benefits to include mental health benefits as well. Another area to consider is, offering benefits that pertain to childcare, home and home services. There's as we've all experienced over the last 18 months, this has become an increasingly challenging area to manage for a lot of the employees. So offering benefits in these areas will keep employees focused during the office hours and really take care of the additional stressors of figuring out various logistics related to childcare and such. And lastly, remote or L&D is an area that often gets overlooked. But in our survey, we learned that 58% of engineers cite learning and development as one of their top criteria when considering a new role. And although, today one can get a lot of this learning and expertise through just online classes or by working with other project teams, it is important for, I apologize for the background noise here. It is important for companies to make a very concerted effort and thoughtful investment in tailoring any of their mentorship and L&D programs to remote work. So with that, let's go through the key takeaways and what we've covered so far today, right? 4 key areas, if you will. First and foremost, define your remote policy or your remote structure and remote policy around that. That is number 1 priority for companies. The second area that we talked about was just detailed guidelines to promote fairness, to treat your remote versus in-office employees equally, not creating that class system for remote employees is going to be very critical. So employers and leaders need to be very mindful of this. We've talked about communication to a great extent today, but again, this will be the key to making sure that both you and your teams are operating successfully. If you're seeing certain employees lack in certain areas, if they need refresher on communication skills, offer it. Sit down and have a chat with them about it. But ensuring that everyone is on top of their game with respect to communication skills is going to be the key to your success. And last but not the least, once you have all these pieces in place, also make sure that you're tailoring your benefits and compensation so that it's more remote friendly. With that, I will hand it over back to you, Amalia, for Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Megan and Tejal, for that great presentation. So we're going to go ahead and take some time for questions now. Just as a reminder to everyone, please be sure to type those questions into the question box in your Zoom control panel there at the bottom. So we do have a couple of questions already. Let's see. Let's start with Jesse. So Jesse asks, asynchronous collaboration is not intuitive. Do you have tips / examples / resources beyond just use Slack? I know we've talked about this a little bit already during the presentation, but Megan, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great question, Jesse, and one we're hearing a lot of our clients are kind of struggling with at the moment is how do we really reinvent for asynchronous? And I think the big thing to remember here is that the experience definitely needs to be reinvented and reimagined. We're in the process of transforming the way that we communicate and collaborate into a more asynchronous environment. And a lot of companies make the mistake of just translating what they were doing in office or synchronously to virtual. And so that's where you see a lot of, meeting fatigue and things like that, because we're relying on sort of the old ways of operating and just translating that to a virtual environment. And what we find is that that's not really leveraging the real power of the technology and the modern work that we're doing. So really focusing in on, I know it's not super specific, but focusing in on reimagining it. get to a whiteboard and rethink how you want to communicate and collaborate as an organization and how you can really leverage those tools to do so asynchronously, and make sure that, you are comfortable with asynchronous as an organization. It takes a lot of behavior and behavioral change and adaptation to just get used to that new way of working and not being able to just, tap people on the shoulder, even via Slack, and get a response immediately. It takes some time to really adopt that new model, and it takes a lot of patience and expectation setting as well. But absolutely, the just use Slack isn't very helpful for people when you're thinking about asynchronous collaboration, because Slack is also one of those tools where, although it provides for asynchronous communication, how many times are we just in Slack messaging back and forth, and we're communicating synchronously just through a channel that could be used asynchronously? So that's where also communication charter comes into place to really share expectations for utilizing that.
Thanks, Megan. And I think another question that actually ties well in with this is, how do we think about that upskilling piece? What are some examples of ways that you've seen companies successfully upskill communication?
Yeah, it's certainly, it depends on where your organization is in terms of their communication skills and, what kind of workforce we're looking at. Are you an organization that has really strong written communication already? If your written communication is already really strong, you're going to be probably having an easier time with effective communication in a remote environment, because so much becomes written when you're working remote. Like, your amount of verbal communication goes down quite a bit. So if you're an organization who is really strong on the verbal side, but maybe the written side isn't quite as strong, then really focusing in on how can we help to improve written communication? How can we give people the tools and resources necessary to allow them the time to write out, and strengthen the instructions they might be giving to somebody for a particular task, providing the context, providing links to the resources. Oftentimes, it's just making sure that we've got the context and the resources needed when we're communicating. So looking back to your employee handbook or other digital resources that you're building is really an important part of that. But customizing that upskilling is going to be important to your organization.
Great, thank you. Another question here from Greg. He asks, we have a third of our employees now out of state. How can we develop a hybrid policy that's fair when there's staff members who won't ever be asked to come to the office? Tejal, do you want to take a stab at this one? Or Megan?
I'll let Megan take a stab at this one.
Okay, sure. This is a really, really great question, Greg. And thank you for asking it. We're hearing a lot about this and just trying to figure out, how do we develop a fair policy when our workforce is distributed and some people won't be asked to come to the office? I think the first question you want to ask yourself is, why are some people being asked to come to the office, and why are some people not being asked to come to the office? Because inherently that is unequal and unfair. So it probably means that you might be able to actually pull back on the ask that you're having of people who are located near the office, and actually, getting into more of that stretch zone of being comfortable with having people who are in close proximity to your office working remotely the same amount as folks who are working out of state. So that's kind of where you want to start asking yourself that question.
Great. Jordan asks, should engineers, especially those in North America, expect their wages to fall as remote working enables greater competition from those in less expensive geographic regions domestically, and potentially far cheaper competition from workers abroad?
Sure, I can take this one. That's a really good question, and a logical one too, right? Because you're seeing a lot of the engineers getting hired globally, and what can we expect? What kind of impact can we expect on the labor market here in the U.S.? Based on what we've seen, and we've been at it for a few years now, we're not seeing the salary go down in the U.S. at all. What is happening though is hiring outside has helped alleviate the shortage. The companies that were just fighting to get the talent, they're now able to get that talent faster. But we're not seeing a reduction in salary in the US, at least not yet. We are, though, on the other side, we are seeing that the salaries are slowly starting to rise in markets outside of the US. Granted, they are nowhere close to US salaries, but they are starting to rise. So that's a trend that we are seeing. If we were to project, a few years out, one might say that, if the global hiring market really picks up and we get really good about hiring talent, regardless of geographical boundaries, then I wouldn't expect US salaries to fall. Maybe the rate of increase that we've been seeing, just the steep rate of increase, that might go down a little bit, but I would not expect the salaries to fall. At least that's not what the data indicates to us. I did also want to take the opportunity to respond to one of the earlier questions that was asked around, asynchronous communication. We did actually have a white paper that we published about a few months ago on this, and I'll just add on everything that Megan has said. Lots of insightful comments there, but I would also say, as far as written communication is concerned, or in general, any communication is concerned, with async communication, it's really, really important to think about three things, which is, ensure that you're giving far more context than you would otherwise if you're seeing these people in person. So ensure that you're giving far more context. Ensure that you are setting a timeline. It's very basic, but we've seen this far too often where people make the ask without setting a timeline. So ensure that you're setting a timeline or a deadline, and then be very, very clear about what you want the other person to do, whether it's directional feedback, whether it's improvement in a certain area, whatever it may be very clear. We'll also post it on the on Zoom here so that you guys can download and have access to the learnings from there.
Great. I think we have time for one quick question more. John asks, are there any labor laws relating to the responsibility of the company for home office environments?
Sure, I can take that one as well. Now, this is a very rapidly evolving landscape. We do know that in certain countries, you are now required to compensate for high-speed internet. So Mexico, for instance, certain parts of Mexico, the employers are required to compensate for high-speed internet. So that's a one big change that we've seen. Not seeing any other requirements as it pertains to home office environment or ergonomics, but definitely seeing compensation with respect to internet. And I would suspect that as the trend continues, you would probably see some regulations or requirements around home office equipment as well. So.
Yeah, and just to really quickly add to that, you will want to, as you're looking at your remote work policy, there should be a section that outlines home office safety, and you will want to be very clear about your liability as an organization and if your workers' compensation policies cover things that might happen in the home office, because OSHA, Occupational Safety and Hazard Association, does have requirements there. So you are liable as an organization for home office safety.
Yep, that's a great point to add, Megan. Thanks for doing that. So it does look like we're out of time for additional questions, but Megan and Tejal, before I take our participants through the wrap up, I just wanted to say thank you both so much for making time for this talk today. And thank you for contributing all of your insights on building remote policies. It was really great having both of you, and we hope to do it again soon.
Thank you so much.
Enjoyed it. Take care.
Okay.
Bye.
So before I do dive into wrap up, I also wanted to provide an opportunity for those of you that are interested in speaking to one of Terminal's team members to hear more about our solutions for building remote global tech teams. So as discussed in this webinar, as remote work does start to enable hiring across new markets, companies have a really critical opportunity to hire top talent across the globe. So Terminal is a simple and scalable solution to hire that talent at speed. And we've built 75 plus teams across Canada, the US, Mexico, Colombia, and Chile. We do the legwork to recruit, onboard, and manage engineering teams for your company so that you can focus on building amazing products. So if you're interested, please select yes on this poll and we will be in touch. A couple of quick reminders just heading into wrap up. This webinar has been recorded and a link will be made available to participants within 24 hours. I'd also like to remind you to please provide your feedback in our post-webinar survey, which should show up in your browser window as you leave the call. So thanks all for joining us for this discussion today, and we'll see you next time.